weather's not too crazy.
And you're good.
Take that.
Good morning from San Francisco, California. My name's Denise Sullivan. We're here at Bird and Beckett Books and Records in Glen Park, and this is the San Francisco Live's Live Talk series. My guest this morning is Mabel Jimenez, a photojournalist and community worker whose work extends into all different areas, but particularly community media. Good morning, Mabel.
Good morning. Thanks for having me, for inviting me. Yeah.
It's been a long time. In fact, 3 years of pandemic since we last sat down and had a conversation. So I'm really glad to see you.
Yeah. No, it went by really fast. It doesn't feel like 3 years.
No, it doesn't. And I would say this because you and I do share this working in media. We were busy, and I know that you were particularly busy documenting the pandemic in your neighborhood. Can you tell me a little bit about that? And also, please, how you fared during these 3 years.
Yeah. Well, I think when you and I talked, I had sort of stopped my role at El Tecolote, like my staff role there that I had for many years, and I was still collaborating with them. And the story that I documented at the border that we talked about, you interviewed me about, that was done through El Tecolote, but more as a collaborator at that point. So I was freelancing, and a lot of things were happening in my life when we talked, just personally. And I was in a situation where I was freelancing a little bit, but it wasn't really like enough to sustain myself. So I started working at this camera store in San Francisco at Sammy's Camera. A lot of people go there. So I started working there around November of 2019. And it was tough. Like, retail's tough. You'll know. Retail's not easy. And then, that was November 2019. And then 4 months later, everything shut down. We were not deemed an essential business. So we closed down, we went home. And it was just like, what's going to happen? My sort of, after doing that project at the border, that went really well, but professionally I was still not super, had like a footing and stability the way that I would have wanted at that point. So it was like a really scary time for a few months, and really not knowing what was I gonna do. And then, El Tecolote reached out and they had, a couple of people had left. And so they were like, there's a lot to report right now, and we need help. You need work. What's going on? So went back to Tecolote, freelancing for a little bit, helping cover the pandemic. And then I got called by the SF Arts Commission, which was really, really unexpected. I'm not like, there's just so many photographers in the Bay Area. There's so many photojournalists. And so I've been working in my little corner of the mission for a long time. So I was really surprised when Meg Schiffler from the SF Arts Commission, she's no longer in that position. She's moved up to something else, but she was the galleries director. And she reached out. She was working at the COVID Command Center. And, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but when the city shut down and a lot of services shut down, there were a lot of city jobs that were kind of, not happening, not being active. Like, if you were we worked in a library and the library's shut down, what do you do? And so a lot of those workers were sort of assigned, and they started working in a lot of the efforts, like, contact tracing and the logistics of putting out all the blue posters that we were seeing everywhere, reminding us to wear masks, and all the work that the city was doing. A lot of these workers were, they've never run a COVID testing site before, and now they were doing it. So there was a lot of sort of pivoting, I think became the word of 2020, was pivoting.
Right.
And she said, all of our galleries are closed, but we want to continue to support the artist. And we also have this COVID Command Center, which at that point was housed in Moscone South building. And, she's like, we're doing all this work, but because we're really it's an emergency situation. It's an emergency response mechanism. And she said that there's all these rules about not taking photos at the COVID command center. And she's like, we're not documenting this. So what, you want to come by? And so she offered this art residency. She offered this art residency to not just to myself, but to 4 artists, 2 photographers, and 2 illustrators. And so I was one of those photographers. And it was a modestly paid project, but it came with a lot of access, and a lot of creative freedom. And it was like, like my career was starting to just like almost in a coma, like starting to just really struggle. And then she just came and like gave me the shock treatment, first aid to my career with that. Like, it really was, I was already kind of documenting stuff with El Tecolote, but it was very, very part-time, very freelance. And so to get this call out of nowhere from the SF Arts Commission and be like, hey, do you want to document this and we'll pay you, and you can pick whatever aspect of the city's COVID response that you want to document. And it was like, I mean, I'm not religious, but I have these visions like of gift from heaven, like this thing that fell on my lap, and she really threw me a lifeline, like creatively, professionally, and financially a little bit. It didn't pay a lot, but it paid. And so, I mean, that really set me on a different course from that point on in the pandemic. And stuff strangely started to pick up, like nonprofits started to ask me to document what they were doing. And strangely, like for my freelance work, it was the busiest I had been since I quit El Tecolote in 2018.
Yeah.
And then like 2020, 2021, it's like all this stuff starts to happen. And it's really weird because all around me, people are losing their jobs and their health and their lives. And it was like rough and hard and scary for like 2-3 months. But then this like snowball of just good things continuously, and partnerships and projects started to happen, to the point where I kind of felt guilty, People are like, how are you doing? And I'm like, I'm kind of okay. I'm sorry. Like, but anyway, so I started documenting for the COVID Command Center, and that was really exciting. And I ended up focusing my documentation on the response of the Latino community. So in San Francisco, so mainly I was documenting in the Mission and the Excelsior, documenting the testing sites, vaccine sites, the places where like people were giving away food because so many people lost their jobs. So I got to see that up close and see all the relief work that people were doing. And that was very like restored my faith in humanity quite a bit, because people were really like, a lot of the people who lost everything were the ones that were like the first ones to go out and volunteer. A lot of people who were undocumented, who didn't get any unemployment, who didn't get any stimulus checks, were the first ones out there volunteering and packing boxes and helping other people and tapping their savings to help other people eat. And to see all of that, it was just like really impressive and mind-blowing, and yeah, just like restorative. And
Yeah. Well, I mean, so much that I want to go back to in there. I mean, in a way, I feel like your career prior to this had prepared you for such an event. I mean, it's not like you were just, waiting around for an opportunity. It's like you have had experience in extreme circumstances. And I'd like to go back to you going to the border during the ongoing refugee crisis at the border. But even just documenting the mission as you had in your years at El Tecolote, you had formed relationships with people in the community, which of course increases your access as a journalist and a photojournalist. And you know where to go to get the story, right? So when that call comes, Mabel, we need some documentation. It's like, of course they're calling you, because you have this history, this archive now of having been embedded in that community. And I feel like there was an emphasis placed on the Latino community and the Black community that took a huge hit during the pandemic because local media, community media, El Tecolote, Mission Local, the Bay View, etc., were successful getting the word out to the mainstream audience and media that we need help. And our people are on the ground helping, but now we need your help, right? And this is, I'm so glad that you revisited it because, as you said, those 3 years went by so quick. It's almost like they didn't happen. But thanks to you and folks like you, we now have a document of some of those works, like you said, essential workers, the people who were formerly employed at the library, suddenly assigned to the food bank. They're in waters that they have no familiarity with, but they're in action, right? And you captured it. It's so beautiful because maybe some of us aren't ready to revisit the first few months of the pandemic yet. But when we are in the people of the future, you will have done it. So thank you for that. Now, I know that there is a culmination of this work that you've compiled, right? Gallery show, book. What are the pandemic times? How is that? How are we going to be able to revisit this now?
Yeah, well, right now I already have some prints that resulted from that documentation that are living in the library. Still working on putting together like the digital catalog so people can actually also search them through the library website. But they can be physically visited now. If you go to the main library by Civic Center, if you go all the way to the top floor, they have all of their sort of historic stuff. You can see, stuff that was printed in like the 1600s. It's insane.
Wow.
And my stuff is there.
Wow.
My stuff is there. And it's, it's a building that's very well protected and it's meant for preservation. And you got to put gloves on and all that stuff and the temperatures, so that's really cool that like, someday I'm going to die. I'm not going to be here. And the work is there. Like the work is not going to go anywhere. And there's always going to be somebody there in the library that's taking care of it and making sure that it's safe and making sure that people can have access to it when they need to. Yeah. Because one thing that, I don't know if you did this, but when the pandemic started, I started hearing about the pandemic from 1918, right? And, I hate calling it the Spanish flu because it's like a weird
Influenza,
thank you. And so I started looking at pictures specifically pictures of what people were doing in San Francisco, and I found like 100-year-old photos of like this Red Cross nurse sewing masks, and it was such a trip because do you know Adriana Camarena? She's an amazing writer.
Sure, yeah.
She was like, she was sewing masks in the first few weeks of the pandemic and giving them away for free because I don't know if y'all remember, or maybe you blocked it out, but it was really hard. First it was like, no, don't buy masks. Doctors need it. And then it's like, nope, buy masks. Nope, double mask. And so anyway, there's a shortage of masks. And anyway, I see this picture of this nurse in the Examiner 100 years ago. And then I'm thinking about my friend, Adriana, who's now sewing masks and all these parallels that are happening. And it's actually really crazy. I started reading about the history and it was so similar. You had your anti-maskers back then. You had your people that were like, no, we got to reopen businesses because the economy. And there was just so many parallels. It was mind-blowing. Yeah. And so now I'm looking at this and it's like, damn, we're just repeating this. The parts that we shouldn't be repeating. So anyway, all that to say, now
it's part of the historical record.
Yeah, it's there. And now when I'm sure we'll have another pandemic at some point. It's not the last one. We're going to look back and be like, well, what was my mother or grandmother doing? Yeah. And, look at that. They're volunteering. Look at that. They're getting their vaccine. They're helping feed people. So that's really gratifying. And like you said, all of that would not have been possible if not for building all those connections from my years working at El Tecolote. Because, it was really great to have the city go, okay, you have the authorization from SF Public Health Department and all these government entities that are allowing you to go in, and they give you like this photo release form because you're photographing people having a medical procedure done. A test and a vaccination are technically medical procedures that are protected by privacy. So you go through all these sort of official steps, but it's one thing to have that access and say, okay, you're official, you can come in, here's your little vest.
Mm-hmm.
But you still have to get a consent from people. I still like,
Right.
hey, are you okay with me photographing you, and with a swab going up your nose for like future generations to see? Are you comfortable
Right.
with that? um and that would have been a lot harder if not for already knowing a lot of people.
Yeah.
That I would walk into like the vaccination site that's on 24th and Cap right now, and it's like, oh hey, there's Martha Sanchez, oh hey, there's so and so, and all these people that I already know. And so it's like, yeah, come on in. And there's this immediate like, not that sort of guardedness that people can have when there's someone documenting. And so that relaxed energy of people trusting me made it easier for me to ask the
Yeah.
strangers that were getting, services to
Yeah.
also be photographed. So, as all these things keep happening in my life, I always keep sort of, yeah, it was because of El Tecolote.
That's it.
I haven't
Yeah.
worked there for a few years, but
Yeah.
it's like I still have a foot inside that newsroom.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. A couple things, because we do want to talk about kind of the future, well, the present and the future of community media. But I was thinking when you were telling the story about access and asking permission, you can't just go in willy nilly and, start taking pictures and thinking people are going to be okay with it.
I mean, some people do.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
but
Some people are like,
it's not
take
that
my
cool.
picture.
Yeah.
But yeah, when we talked about when you went to, and now you have to remind me, was it 2018 when you loaded that van with supplies?
2019.
2019, okay. In the fall of 2019, I guess, yeah. Loaded that van with supplies and took them to Tijuana, and spent 2 weeks, right, in and around the refugee crisis centers, taking photos of people who were in trauma, crisis, and having to broach that subject. Excuse me, is it okay? Do you mind? Now, that is not something that happens overnight. And as you said, oftentimes reporters will parachute into these situations and kind of just make a mess of things or overstep, right? I'd like to know, well, I think we have to talk a little bit about what drove you to the border and your passion for that situation, but also how you navigated that sensitive time.
Yeah. So I grew up in Tijuana. I grew up on the border. So I was always kind of witnessing there's all these different points throughout the border that you can cross, but Tijuana specifically is this international gateway, and in fact it's the most visited city in the world. Tijuana, not because of tourism, not because of people coming to like, necessarily do things like that, but because it's a crossing point. So there's always been this cultural movement and exchange, and also there's like I don't know what to call it, like a symbiotic relationship between Tijuana and San Diego. There's a lot of exchange there. There's a lot of people that work in one place and live in the other. So there's a lot of overlap just in general. So to me, immigration, multiculturalism had always been like normal to me and acceptable and good. And then, we got what's his face on the White House. Not that he was the first one to give immigrants a hard time. But it really made things worse than they needed to be. And a lot of the people that were, well, when I was growing up, it was usually people from Mexico who were crossing the border. And this time it was people coming all the way from Central and South America, crossing multiple countries just to get to Mexico and the border. And they had to deal not only with being undocumented in the US, but being undocumented in Mexico and all the other previous countries that they're coming through.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a really harrowing, dangerous journey. People are, exploited and taken advantage of on their way there, women in particular. So people like they're already fleeing from trauma, right? And then there's the trauma of the travel itself, the journey in itself. And then you reach Tijuana or another border city in Mexico, and because of the Remain in Mexico policy that was enacted in the previous administration, people could no longer be in the US while their asylum seeking process was being handled. And, it never hurts to say it, but seeking asylum is not illegal, which a lot of people seem to have the wrong idea about that. But it's perfectly legal for people to come and seek asylum. But what changed under Trump was, that's fine, we'll give you asylum, but we're going to take our time. And you have two options. You can either wait in Mexico or you can come on over here and we'll hold you in one of our detention centers. And I think that there was this misconception that all the people in immigration detention centers were people that were caught trying to cross like some hole in the wall or something. And it wasn't that simple. It was people that surrendered themselves for asylum, who were being detained as if they had committed a crime. So anyway, that's what was happening, what is still happening.
Yeah.
Even under Biden, it's still happening, and in many ways it's becoming worse. But anyway, all this caused for a lot of these border cities in Mexico to really swell up with refugees. And a lot of these border cities were not prepared to accommodate them, to offer them assistance, to even welcome them, really. And in Tijuana, which is where I grew up, there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, which was really bizarre to me. In a city like Tijuana, that's been that for so long, to now see people from the town that I grew up telling Central Americans, hey, don't come here. That was just not right,
Yeah. You also mentioned people from countries that, I mean, I didn't realize that there were people from literally all over the world that were stopped there. You mentioned people from Ghana, people from Russia, some of the other countries. It really took me aback.
Yeah.
And that some of these folks, particularly Black people, were really singled out, as were LGBTQ folks, and not welcome.
Yeah.
Not welcome, right? So there was a whole second layer of second, third,
Yeah.
layers of trauma here, but
Yeah.
that special camps or situations were set up to protect folks that were at extreme risk. Correct?
Yeah, no, that's totally right. There were people from all over the world, from the countries you mentioned and more. A lot of Haitian migrants,
Right.
because I believe this goes back to the earthquake in, was it 2010 or something? It's been a minute.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it sent a lot of Haitian folks on this whole trek. A lot of them went, I believe, I want to say Brazil, where there was a
Yep. There was the Olympics.
Olympics.
People
or
went for
World Cup.
work.
Yeah, people
and
were building
then-
stadiums and things like that. So there was a lot of work for
And
Haitians.
the work was over.
Yes, that's right. Then the work was over. They were done building all these stadiums and whatnot, and so then a lot of people started going to the U.S. And this was under Obama, that they started coming to the U.S. And at some point, something changed, and the laws decided to not admit them anymore. And a lot of Haitians got deported, and a lot of them just decided to stick it out in Mexico. And now there's like this little Haiti in Tijuana. There's like a thriving Haitian community. There's people from all over the world, but there's a
Yeah.
lot of Haitians. And that's something so new to Tijuana. And that has added like a beautiful, new element to the culture and the dynamics there. But it is because, wherever you
Yeah.
go, Black people tend to fare the worst. And even in the immigration refugee space, they tend to be treated the worst. and LGBT folks as well. Some of these refugee shelters that people were staying at were managed by churches, and not all churches down there are accepting of people that are on the LGBTQ spectrum. So, yeah, I talked to a lot of people that endure discrimination from their own families, endure discrimination from the services that were supposed to be helping them during this very traumatic time. And people, that's why people had to create their own spaces, create a little Haiti, create shelters like Casa de Luz and Casa Arcoiris, which are LGBT refugee shelters in Tijuana.
Right, but people are also fleeing domestic violence and other violent situations, right? So they have to be safe houses as well. So this idea that you were coming in to photograph was sensitive, but how did you find the people, were responding to that kind of exposure?
Well, I should say the main reason I went there was to take the donations.
Yes.
I have family down there, so I was gonna visit anyway, and then it became this sort of like, well, I'm driving there anyway. Let's put some, like, I don't know, bottles of water in the trunk and take it down there. And then I started telling my friends, like, do you have any extra socks or what? And then it's just started snowballing. It got way out of my control. And a lot of people donated a lot of stuff. And I did not have room to store it. Nobody that I ended up storing it with Nancy Charraga, who owns Casa Bonampak, which used to be located on Valencia Street.
Right.
It's now an online store, but she was located in Valencia Street back then, and she had this huge basement under her store, and she let me store so much stuff. Like, I took over her basement for a couple of months. So anyway, so the main goal was like, now I have all this stuff, and now it's like now just distributing it, organizing, washing all the clothes, like sorting stuff out, what's useful, what's not, became its own project in itself. And then when people would ask me, like, are you going to take photos? Are you going to report? I was like, we'll see if I can swing it.
Right.
But I have to I have to unload all this stuff. That's priority one. And so what happened was I ended up meeting a young man down there, David Vasquez from Guatemala, who had also made his way to Tijuana. This young 22-year-old guy who also had been through a lot of the shelters volunteering, and he sort of became, I guess, like my fixer down there. And a fixer, in journalism is someone that helps you just understand the lay of the land in a place that's new to you. And even though I grew up in Tijuana, I never had any awareness of this, of refugee shelters and of that experience when I was growing up in Tijuana. And so I met this young guy who was like, okay, let's go to this shelter. Let's go. Okay. Oh, this shelter needs diapers. That shelter needs socks. And so, I would be driving and he would be my navigator, and it just made the experience a lot easier and safer for me. But, so anyway, when we would get to a place, the main priority was like, okay, let's get stuff distributed and make sure that that's taken care of. And then I would speak first to whoever was the shelter manager, right? That's the person that's sort of used to putting themselves out there in order to, when you have an organization that you're championing, you need to put yourself out there to support it or to get support. So that's what I would start with first, is the people that were kind of in charge, that are comfortable being seen. And then I would ask them, do you think anybody here would be open to sharing in their experience? So I wouldn't just kind of like show up and just
Right.
hey, what's going on? Don't mind me. So I had to really and if I wanted to photograph, sometimes it was more about getting like a sense of place. Like, what is it like to be in a place like this? And so they would, give a heads up. Hey, here's a reporter. She's working on something. So if you don't want to be photographed, just, let her know, or turn your back, whatever you need to do. And so there was like a lot of checking in step by step and sort of gradually coming there. And if I was in a space and I would notice someone kind of checking me out, or someone would start chatting with them and telling them what I'm doing and asking them if they would be interested. And it was the tricky part was making sure that people didn't feel obligated because I just dropped off a donation, that they didn't feel obligated, like, oh, well, I guess I better talk to her. I guess I better let her take a picture of me. So sometimes I would kind of like come back on a different day after I had left the donations so that maybe maybe they didn't see me giving the, you know what I mean? Maybe they
Yeah.
didn't feel that sense of obligation, or sometimes I would ask the questions in a way to like give them an out,
Yeah.
like do you have time? It's easier to say no to like, oh, I'm kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
like, I would kind of build in an excuse
Yeah.
for them to make it easier to say no.
Yeah.
And some people did say no, but most people said yes. And sometimes I would also leave it up to whoever was the person in charge and say, do you want to ask and see who feels comfortable? And in
Yeah.
fact, in one of these LGBT shelters called, this was Casa de Luz, which actually used to be, oh no, I'm wrong. This is Jardín de las Mariposas. I'm sorry, the Garden of Butterflies, it's called. And that was actually started as a, what's it called? As a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center. Because again, like discrimination and homophobia and transphobia is unfortunately so widespread and accepted in a lot of places that even just being able to get service for, and healthcare for dealing with addiction comes fraught with discrimination throughout that process. So
Yeah.
it's the space for that. And so they're just, this rehab center. And then as migrants start coming in and LGBT people are looking for a safe place to be, they're like, well, there's this place. And so this rehabilitation center found itself also being a refugee welcoming center.
Right.
And, and there was a lot of overlaps in what people's experiences were. But at one occasion in that particular shelter, again, after donating and making sure everybody had what they needed, then it was like, okay, why don't you help me? I don't want to put anybody on the spot. So like the organizer there left the room and then asked the room of people who were staying there who would be wanting to share that story. And I just kind of waited, and then this young man came out and started talking to me and you know pouring his heart out. And it's kind of sad because I feel like a lot of people have been waiting
Yeah.
to share that. And I feel like when you're in a situation where we've all had our trauma, like it's everyone's just sort of taking care of themselves. And when someone asks you like, what has it been like? What brought you here? Why did you have to leave your country? In some cases, it just came pouring out.
Right.
And you mentioned one of the main story that I kept hearing over and over and over was gang violence. Gangs taking over, particularly in Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, where if you have, for example, if you're a small business, this is one story that I heard a lot, was small business owners. Even if you're like, oh, grandma makes really good soup. She should start selling her soup on Sundays or something. And you set up a couple of folding chairs outside on a Sunday and you put a little tablecloth and you start selling it. Someone will notice that, right? And then they notice, they're like, oh, she got nicer chairs. Oh, she got nicer plates. Oh, her little business is thriving. It's time to start collecting the war tax. And the war tax is basically what you pay to gangs to not be bothered if you're a small business owner. So I heard versions of that story multiple times. I heard stories of children being recruited into gangs because children are often used to sort of send messages. They send them on a bike, tell so and so this and that, to send items, to send cell phones, to send money. Children are used for this. So I met one family or one man who told me, my 10-year-old nephew is being recruited by gangs. And it's not just as easy to say, no, thank you, pass. It's like, no, that in itself gets you into trouble. So it's like you can choose this life or you can flee.
Yeah.
Those are the choices that a lot of people have. So it came down to that. And of course, some of the LGBT folks that I met were fleeing both institutionalized homophobia, transphobia, as well as whether institutionalized, whether in their own homes. So that was kind of the main thing. I think there's this misconception, and maybe, if we're talking about 20, 30 years ago, people come here to have a better life, like economically, or to have,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Now it's not so much about having a better life, it's just about surviving, having a
Wow.
life, period,
Yeah.
being able to live. So that's one thing that has changed really
Yeah.
from when I was coming up,
Yeah.
to now.
I would say, interesting that, we've just talked about you covering these unfolding and ongoing crises. It's important to mention that this is still
Yeah.
happening. And if people would like to see your work and documentation of of what we just spoke of, that is available on your website.
It
Is that true?
is. Yep.
Yeah, and that full report is also there. And then we talked about the pandemic photos being able to be seen, but these are all, as you just described, very high crisis, intense situations. I know you also document joy and cultural exuberance and, this everyday life
Yeah.
in San Francisco as we know it. Um, Talk a bit about your commitment to community works and storytelling of everyday people.
Yeah. Well, when I went to SF State for studied journalism, and chose, like, when you study journalism there, you can sort of choose a specialization, and I chose photojournalism. And then my first job out of college was with El Tecolote. Their photo editor had just left, and so it was just really good timing for me. They're like, "You want to be a photo editor?" And especially in those years, this was like 2010. El Tecolote was like really small. It's still a small operation, but it was even smaller then. It was even less resources then. So I didn't really get any, like, this is how you photo edit.
Right.
It was just like, just kind of putting together what I thought it should be. And but it was really just like, here's the keys, and make sure the photos are at CMYK for print and RGB for digital, and good luck with everything else. And it was like, whoa, a challenge, but also, sounds so cheesy, but it's a challenge and an opportunity, right?
Yeah.
Because okay, then I get to do this, what I want to do. And even though there was a lot of challenges being a small community media, being ethnic media, there's a lot of challenges. But within that, we always had the support of the community. We were able to put out, in my time there, we were able to put out the only special photo issue that the paper has had in its 52-year history. I started a yearly photo exhibit, which was kind of interrupted with the pandemic, but it ran for 6 years. The Latino Life Photography exhibit, and I don't know of any other ongoing photography exhibit in the Bay Area that specifically highlights Latino life in the Bay. So I was really proud of that. Um, and I got a little side. um,
No, that's
what's the?
okay.
Oh, yeah, yeah. We're talking about just documentation overall. Um, so I'm not from the mission. I grew up in Mexico, but the mission really really embraced me. They embrace El Tecolote, and so I think that anybody that's supportive of El Tecolote also just gets embraced by connection. Um, and it was really a really great way to get to know the community. I don't think I would understand it in the way that I do, if it wasn't for being so intimately, involved with understanding it through all these stories that we were covering. Um, and yeah, I one thing I learned with El Tecolote was that, we have all these different, so much media outlet, so
Mm-hmm.
many media outlets in the Bay Area, in
Mm-hmm.
San Francisco, just in the mission. Like, there's just so much going on, media wise, but there's no, there was no sort of one place that you can go and say, oh, here's all the visual archive of this or that community. And
Right.
you have big mainstream outlets like the Chronicle and KQED, that are kind of, they do a great job, but they're kind of regional, right? And they're spread out. And so we really rely on community neighborhood papers to tell us, like, what are the things that are affecting me and my neighbors. And so that's what El Tecolote, that's the role that we fulfill. But when you're not only a small community media, but when you're an ethnic media outlet, like, yeah, okay, the Chronicle, KQED, etc., they all cover the Latino community amongst many other communities. Um, but there was no sort of visual archive where we could just find our stories. And as I started working as a photo editor, and then, opening up all these old files and seeing archives of what images have other photographers taken since the 70s, since the paper's been around, and going through all these file cabinets, it became really clear that, like, I'm not just photographing for now to put the picture on the paper now and it comes out and people read it, forget about it, go on to the next thing because that's the news cycle. It's like, okay, we might kind of toss it in the recycling now, but someday this is building something bigger than just that story for the paper, than just that article. And then as you start seeing this accumulation, it starts to tell a story by itself. And so that was part of the reason why I created that photo exhibit. It's because we need to not just see it here and there, but to see it compiled and see it in a way that is curated and that it makes sense. And as people in my freelancing periods, when different organizations have hired me to cover this event or that event or this part of their work, I didn't always think of it as like, oh, I'm building this neighborhood archive. But as you start sort of seeing these separate assignments or disjointed assignments, and you start seeing that you're building a body of work, and you're seeing, well, I didn't intend it that way, but now it's starting to say something beyond what this org or that org wanted to get out of this particular set of photos. And there's a saying, for writers, or for writing journalists, they say they have the first crack at writing history, right? And for photographers, we get front row seats to that history. So sometimes it's easy to forget that, to lose perspective of that when you're kind of like, it's 8 a.m. and when is this event gonna start? I'm cold. Where's the speakers? Like, you're not thinking about it back then. You're just trying to just get through that assignment and on to the next one. But then you look back, and I've been doing this for a minute, and I'm looking back at photos I took 20 years ago when I first got to the US, and I was just sort of playing around, and now I see it with these different eyes of like an editor and a curator, and I was like, like, I was doing okay. I would believe in me now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about these historic moments, and everything's kind of accelerated right now just because of the times being what they are, right? But I'm thinking, you were at El Tecolote during the height of the displacement crisis that was happening in the Latino community in San Francisco. I mean, this is something that people are still and will be talking about because of the loss of the population, the housing, and the violence that goes with displacement. You had a front row seat to that, right? For better and for worse.
Yeah.
Probably lost some friends in the process along the way, I imagine.
Yeah, definitely seen a lot of people move out. Luckily, I did not lose friends to the COVID pandemic. I did lose 2 of my uncles in Mexico, unfortunately, because it's the fucking pandemic. People died. But yeah, no, I'm forgetting, like, oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I'm telling you.
Gentrification.
Telling
it's been a minute.
Yeah, police
so
violence.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you were like right there when this stuff was happening. I will just remind you. But I would like to, I wanted to get back this idea of how, community media is see, it comes as no surprise to me that the Arts Commission and other entities would call you, Mabel Jimenez, on the ground, embedded in her community, if they wanted coverage from that community. There are other folks at the other news organizations, and I know that you work with some of them now in your new role at Catchlight Media. I would like to talk about, if you don't mind, visual storytelling, the different community media organizations that you work with, and how you intuitively, now as an editor, I would say, if something's happening in Berkeley or if something is happening downtown, in your mind, you must know who to call by virtue of the fact that these folks are committed to their community, to their immediate neighborhood, and you need something from over here. Boom. I like to think that, maybe someone would call me in my area of expertise, but you know what I'm saying. You have a commitment to young reporters covering their communities, mostly marginalized communities that are not seeing mainstream coverage, to tell these stories that would otherwise go unrecorded, correct?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, but that's general and broad. Could you make it a little more specific and tell us what Catchlight Media is doing with its mission, and you in particular, about pulling in these young reporters?
Yeah. Well, I feel like before I explain what Catchlight does, I want to give a little context of what the field of journalism has been like. And, we used to live in a time, and this as a bookstore, where people love buying things that they could hold in their hands, made of paper, and words were on them. There was a golden age for that, and this is no longer it. So, in the last 20, 30 years, a lot of newspapers have closed down or downsized. I think in the last 20 years, we've lost about half of the papers in California. Half. Which is insane. And when we think about downsizing, the first people to get fired are always the photographers or the designers or the people who do anything visual. Part of the reason, and I'm not I'm not gonna blame everything on the phones, on the iPhone, whatever, but there is a sort of hey, you're a writer, you got a phone in your pocket with a camera, you can take the photos, right? And so photographers become expendable, even though the quality of the photos, whether it's for the technology reasons or for the reasons that you're not, like, a person that's not trained in visual storytelling, is not going to approach it in the same way, right? Their job is to write, and then they'll take a photo, as opposed to the way that a photographer or photojournalist would approach it. So, and there's many factors that go into it, but it's a real paradox that we're living in an age where we rely on images. Like, how many photos do we even see in one day scrolling on Instagram, going out on the street, and advertisings and movies, and there's a play, they need to take like everything uses imagery and photos. And so why is it that we live in the age where we rely on image and visual communication more than any other time in history? But it's looked like the hardest time to be a visual communicator.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And thanks for giving us that context, because I can tell you right now the times where someone has said, well, you can just take the photos, right? And I'm like, no, I can't, because I am not trained in photography. Just leave the writing to me and send a photographer. Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have a photographer. And it also works both ways. So we don't have a photographer, so I guess we'll kill the story.
Yeah.
So you have less coverage and less visual elements. So go ahead.
Yeah, and I think there's this way of seeing things where the writing, like if you take and by the way, I say newspaper a lot. I don't necessarily mean just like an actual paper. Right. I mean like online publications. I just say newspaper for short. But and I lost my train of thought.
Oh, we were talking about the rise of the technology, and then how visual stuff is so predominant.
Oh,
and yet.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for like reining my goofy brain. Yeah, and so there's this conception in a lot of papers and media outlets that the writing is sort of the main product, and the photo is like an extra or like an accessory to this sort of main dish that is the writing, and photography is just like the little garnish that you add at the end, and it shouldn't be that way. It's been, demonstrated, studies have been done, all this, that people remember stories better when there's an image. People relate to stories better. You can tell me something about numbers of people, that are dying of COVID and what neighborhoods are struggling with this and that, and that's great. But if you show me and I can see people with my own eyes doing that, going through that, it hits your brain and it hits your emotions in a different way. Um, when I think of periods of history where I was not alive, I don't think of like headlines that come to my mind, or sound bites that come. There's images that come to my mind, or video clips that come to my mind. We're visual, creatures. Um, so that's some of the context. So with the decline of journalism, if journalism has declined, visual journalism has plummeted in terms of this, just how much images you see in a newspaper that aren't like outsourced to, wire services like AP, or pulled off of your source's Facebook or whatever it is. So there's like less quality of images being used. People who are visual journalists, their livelihood is become extremely challenging. And Catchlight, the org that I work for, they put out this report, the state of the industry. And if you just Google Catchlight state of the industry, you'll find it. And it's bleak. It's
Wow.
bleak how much people make or don't make, being visual journalists or doing photography and other visual communication. And of course, all of this stuff is worse if you happen to be like part of a marginalized group. Um, so it's not an easy time, and it has not been an easy time to be a visual journalist for a while. Um, and it's just kind of been going in that direction, and it's something that I've been thinking about for years, as photo editor at Tecolote now. And it's just felt like it's just like no one's doing anything. Like,
Right.
our patient is dying here and needs
Yeah.
CPR. Can we, like, come on, guys? And so Catchlight is this amazing organization. It's a nonprofit, and I may butcher the mission statement, but it leverages the power of visuals to inform and connect communities, right? And this sounds all very abstract,
Yeah.
but what they do is they provide resources for a lot of folks out there who are really leading the way in visual documentation, visual archiving, like not necessarily just people that are working on, for example, like photo essays in that way, but people that are working in other kinds of documentation. And so they have, these fellowships, and they've had these, global fellowships for a while now. And they, sponsor a lot of people doing amazing projects. And this year, they started something completely new, which is now local fellowships. And this new project is called, Catchlight Local California. And so the desire there is to work in one state. We're starting with California, but we are hoping to, like, if this model is proves to work, we're hoping to expand it. But basically, they're like, okay, we live in a different world, right? Than when visual media is what was in a better place. We can't go back to that. We can't go back in time, but we can think of like what the world is like now, and what media is like now, what resources they have now. How do we make that work now? And so nobody knows. Nobody knows
Right.
the answer. We're trying to figure it out. Catchlight kind of like put together this model and like, well, let's see if this is what we can do. And so it is kind of an experiment, but basically the idea is that Catchlight, um, helps subsidize the salary of a full-time visual journalist, which we call a fellow, because it's a fellowship. And right now we have 6 fellows, and each of those fellows is hosted by a different newsroom in California. So we have also 6 newsrooms, and a fellow that we host in each one. And so not all, but most of those news organizations don't have any visual, don't have, I think only two of them have photo editors. For a couple of them, it's the first visual journalist in the history of the publication. I mean, visual journalism has been in decline for so long that now we have an entire generation of journalists working who've never worked with a full-time photographer, to don't sort of know how that's supposed to go and how that's supposed to work. And so I come in as a photo editor or visuals editor to help the newsroom and like, okay, this is how you guide your photographer, because it's not as you know, like athletes need coaches, right? And orchestras need directors and photographers need photo editors. And so I work directly with the photographers. We have like a lot of one-on-one conversations, and you know, I support them in the gamut of work that they do. So maybe it's like, hey, Mabel, I photographed this set of photos. Can you help me narrow them down? Did I write this caption correctly? I have this weird ethical situation. How do I, you know, what do I do there? How do I photograph this person who wants to remain anonymous? Like just all these different things, workflow, like just all these things that come with being a photographer. And so I work with the photojournalists themselves, and then with the newsrooms, we kind of think a little bit more bigger picture. Like how do we, for example, how do we switch our workflow so that photography ideas don't come at the end of the process where it's like, oh, we have a story. I guess we can start thinking, you know what I mean? It's and we have to publish tomorrow, by the way. Good luck. You know, so it's like, no. Let's move this decision idea process earlier so that the photographs and the access can be done right with the time that's required. And so so we're helping folks, you know, the newsrooms and the photographers navigate this and sort of come back to like, what is it like to have a regular photographer in a newsroom? And so we give them that support. We also help support the salary of the photographer that's stationed there. And I should also mention another big organization called Report for America, which is also helping sponsor and put a lot of people in newsrooms, especially in small community newsrooms, which is where we really need them. So that's what we're trying out and seeing like, okay, the goal is that these newsrooms will see the value. And see, for example, like their community engagement numbers start to grow, and look at our followers and look at the comments and look how people are engaged and look at the difference this story made and look at how the story helped change policy at the local level. And so the hope is that as those newsrooms start seeing like, oh yeah, this is really good for us, that they'll want to keep the fellow there, and that after the fellowship ends, our goal is that the newsrooms will say, okay, can we hire you so that we can keep you? Wow. And so every year that there's a fellowship, we kind of subsidize a little bit less and a little bit less. To so the newsroom gradually be able to fulfill that and pay that salary on their own. And that's already kind of happened in some of the pilot programs where this amazing journalist, Jessica Parado, she's in Berkeley and she's been documenting the homelessness crisis there. And she's an amazing photojournalist with a lot of empathy and heart. And, you know, she was a fellow working for the SF Standard and, SF Public Press, for the SF Public Press. And after her fellowship ended, they decided to keep her. Another fellow in Salinas, working with the Salinas Californian, another very small paper, David Rodriguez, they decided to keep him after his fellowship was over. So they run this pilot program. So it's like, okay, let's scale it. And so now we have 6 newsrooms and we're getting ready for 3 more in 2023. So we're going to grow to 9. And that's kind of the model.
I love it. I was really impressed with some of the coverage of the communities that that were featured by some of the reporters. Looks at the vehicular living community, reports from the Tenderloin about people that were not necessarily addicted to drugs or dealing with mental health issues, but just residents of the Tenderloin, farm workers, people who are living in community and their lives would be otherwise unrecorded were it not for these reporters. I hate to tell you that
Uh-oh.
it is that time again, and there is so much more to talk about Mabel Jimenez. I would, it occurred to me that one of the services you could provide these young photojournalists is when you go out, you shoot thousands of images, right? And it just like winnowing it down to those choice few that really tell the story. I feel that is a strength of yours, and that your images are so beautiful. I would encourage people to go and look at them at your website, which is mabeljimenez.com, correct?
Yes.
And you could see the work at the San Francisco Public Library at the top floor. You can see the work that the reporters are doing at catchlightmedia.com.
Mm-hmm. Oh, catchlight.io.
Catchlight.io. And anything else before we go, because we are out of time, that you want to alert us about coming up?
Yeah, I just want to encourage people to support their local media. Wherever you live, just Google what's my neighborhood paper, or what's the small paper nearest me. Subscribe to it. Subscribe to the newsletter. I know it sounds a little bit old-fashioned almost, but it will help you feel more connected with your neighbors. I promise you that. So, that's pay photographers if you hire them. Pay them. Pay what they charge. Pay artists. Pay people that are just doing their work out there and, working for the arts, working for media. And I do want to shout out really quick the newsrooms that we are working with Cal Matters in Fresno, working with Black Voice News in Riverside, working with India Currents in San Jose, working with Oakland Side in Oakland and Berkeley Side in Berkeley, working with Bay City News in Stockton. And we're about to add 2 more newsrooms. El Tímpano, which is a bilingual newsroom in Oakland that covers the Latino and the Mayan community. And the rum roll, El Tecolote newspaper, is also going to be the Catchlight desk. So I'm actually going to go back to editing photos for that. You guys cannot get rid of me.
That's it.
So yeah, I just wanted to make sure to mention those names.
That's great. Yeah. Well, lucky award-winning El Tecolote and award-winning Mabel Jimenez. Lucky for San Francisco and all of us that you do the work that you do. And best wishes. Really great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and lucky San Francisco for having Denise Sullivan as
someday we will collaborate. That is my side plan here by getting you here today. We'll be back next month, second Sunday of every month, 10 a.m. SF Lives, live talks. Our guest will be Graciela Ronconi, a small business owner and vintage clothing expert. She's going to tell us about the state of small business and vintage clothing in our city. Really great history, 30 years in the business. So we'll see you again. Thanks again, Mabel. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Jenna. Thanks, Bird and Beckett. Thanks, Gabby.